Our panel this morning is in your books. I won't go into great detail, but we have Fahd al-Rasheed, Joe Cross, Arun Sundararajan, and Chris Turner. And we're going to start with just a quick round of question to all of you about one major driver that you might identify as something in urban tech that is changing the way we live that we haven't heard about this morning. So, Fahd, could I start with you?
Sure. We've been building King Abdullah Economic City for the past 10 years. We're already on the hitting that economy of scale. We'll have the largest port in the country by end of this year, and the most successful industrial zone, I believe, in the region. But the reason I mention this is that over that 10 years, we've changed our master plan 4 times. This has been driven by the fact that the way we think about being ecologically friendly and sustainable has changed over the past 10 years. But although our master plan is one of the most advanced master plans in the world, I think it should be scrapped. And the reason for this is that although we're building a city that is considered to be at the edge of master planning and development, we really are building a 20th century city. Because we don't know what a 21st century city would look like. We don't know how the Internet of Things, the sharing economy, and the driverless car will change the way our cities look, because our cities are physical manifestations of both our technological development as human beings, but also our economic structures and social structures. So I think that the biggest question that we should be asking ourselves, and I know at the NewCities Foundation that you're looking into it, is what will a 21st century city look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Joe, TransferWise is very much involved in trying to think through where all this is heading. Give us a sense from your perspective.
Can I just ask, who's heard of TransferWise here, by the way? Like 2 people, or 3 people. I discovered that some of the NewCities Foundation staff are our customers, actually, which was very cool. So anyway, what TransferWise is, we're essentially building a platform for the world to replace Western Union and to replace international wire transfers, to replace any current means of sending money across borders, because that system is just broken and it doesn't serve customers, it serves the banks, basically, or anyone who's willing to give someone an unfair exchange rate and tell customers they're getting a free transfer. That's what we're basically replacing. So by definition, our customers are incredibly global. They tend to live in cities. They're heavily over-indexed for being migrants, foreign nationals of any kind living in one of the 60 countries we operate in. So I think one trend that I see day to day is, the world is becoming more global without any question. I moved to New York last year, and I just personally feel the benefits of being more global on a sort of individual level. There's about 250 million people that live today in a country other than the one they were born in, and that's 40% increased from what that number was in the year 2000. That's just a crazy trend, like over less than 20 years for that to nearly double. So that's one thing that is completely changing the fabric of cities. And then the second thing, which I'm pretty sure you're going to talk about, so I won't steal it, is basically the on-demand economy and the fact that, if you use TransferWise, you never need to go to Western Union again. You never need to physically go there. You never need to go to the bank to make a wire. If you use Seamless, you don't need to go to a restaurant if you choose. So our relationship with the physical world around us is being fundamentally changed as a result of technology and potentially making us incredibly lazy humans who could live our whole life just sitting on the sofa. So
as we are today.
Yeah, exactly. So there's both positives and massive negatives, I think, as kind of the on-demand economy plays out.
Arun, you're very much a major observer of this change, as we just heard. Tell us a bit about your first sense of what we might expect.
Okay, well, as Joe keyed me up, maybe I should turn this around so that you can actually see the cover. This is why I'm a professor and not a marketing executive. So I'm walking around carrying my book because it came out last week, but it's also sort of the answer to your question. This isn't just facetious marketing. It's, I anticipated your question, and then I wrote an entire book just to answer it.
Thank you. If only all our panelists were so
quickly
responsive.
Yes, and I was sort of expecting everybody to come with their own, but that's what they told me before I accepted the invitation. But here's the thing. I mean, there's certainly, as Joe points to, a sort of a change in the relationship that we have with the physical world that we interact with, that is now mediated by digital technology. And that changes how you think about, designing a city, sort of city life, the need for community in cities. And it's fascinating because it's sort of taking the impact of digital technologies out of the digital world, out of the world of like streaming music and getting your news online, and into the physical real world of real estate planning, of zoning, of mobility, of like how do you get your food, of soon it will sort of impact how you get your healthcare, how you get your energy. And so if there's one thing that I think is reshaping urban lifestyles and will over the next 20 years, it's this notion that we interact with the real world through a digital interface. And this fundamentally changes how we think about infrastructure planning. That is, we don't build in a way that is sort of centralized, but we start to think about infrastructure as a crowd-based thing, where you may not build a public transit system, you may instead have on-demand mobility that is provided by the people who are also users of it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, that really is a provocation also about how future infrastructure has to be working. And Chris, you have a perspective about this, I know, as a Canadian, but also a global citizen. Can you give us some insight into where your head goes with this?
Yeah, well, I think the thing that sometimes gets lost in these discussions is actually the most important piece, and it's something actually that Mayor Denis Coderre said right at the end of his speech this morning. He said, this is ultimately all about quality of life, which sounds like one of those sort of empty phrases we throw around, but that actually is the single most important thing driving which cities are successful and which aren't. As we see this massive shift from digital economy, from the introduction of renewable energy and smart grids and decentralized systems of all kinds, it does ultimately, though, come down to places and whether they are places that people want to be and linger in. And so even though we've got all these digital tools and the rest of it, if anything, that's actually created a greater emphasis on great public space in cities and creating sticky places to hang out. And I think often of and study quite thoroughly the Copenhagen model. When we talk about quality of life, what is it? Copenhagen's usually right near the top of livable city, sustainable city indexes, that kind of thing. And what makes Copenhagen a great thing? Other cities come and they measure the size of the bike lanes and the rest of it and say, oh, maybe it's this or maybe it's that. But it's ultimately just a city that has a lot of really, really great public space to spend time in. And the great Jan Gehl, the great sort of design guru of Copenhagen, when he talks about the city, he doesn't talk about technology. He doesn't talk about the fact that everyone's carbon footprint is 80% smaller than the average Canadian's, though it is. He talks about places to spend time in. And so I think that part is something we need to not lose, is that ultimately the single biggest error we made of the last half century or so was building our cities for cars instead of people. And that doesn't mean that cars are necessarily wrong. They do certain things really well. But planning our cities around the ease of use for cars was a disaster. And undoing that is actually one of the first things that a lot of cities have to do, especially in Canada.
Yeah, and speaking of planning our cities, Fahd, you are one of the few people in this room, there are others, but you're one of the few who is building a city from scratch. And for so many of us, the experience of urban life is coming to a place that's already more or less spoken for. You've said in the past, be careful not to over-engineer cities. Can you give us a little feeling of how new urban lifestyles in Saudi Arabia are changing and how that's affecting your thinking about King Abdullah Economic City?
Well, I talked a bit about our master plan, just so talking from a top-down approach. And our master plan had canals that made the city look like Venice. There's a very romantic notion of a new city in Saudi Arabia, that a place that has no water. I was in New York during Hurricane Sandy, and I saw the power of nature, and that we cannot, as human beings, really over-engineer our cities to accommodate what the natural disasters that might occur. So you have to let nature take its course in our cities. And so we changed that. We removed the canals. We have now what we call wadis, which are the natural storm drainage networks that are already existing. We protect them, and then we actually landscape them in a sustainable way to allow people to use them. In Saudi Arabia, by the way, I spent less than 1% of my time outside. I almost never go outside. And if you think about us, we are Bedouins. We're supposed to be outside. We were, before 60 years ago, we used to live outside. And so we want to bring back nature into our lives in Saudi Arabia by giving a lot more public spaces to Saudi. So we have 100 miles of equestrian and walking trails in the city now. That's one. The second, so that's a top-down view. There is a bottom-up view, I think, from a citizen perspective. Our cities have to accommodate the future lifestyle. I love the introduction around the cafe and how the cafe is becoming a meeting space. Cafes have always been meeting spaces across cultures and across centuries. The reason now they're becoming actual working space is the future of work. The way we work in the future will change. Apps, 3D printing, are dropping barriers to entry across all industries. It's amazing what the past 10 years, how much that has changed. It means that it's much easier to start a business. It means that you no longer need to sell 40 hours of your time, but you can sell a skill set. And you don't need to be employed full-time for that. So you can actually have teams that come together for a specific task in a cafe. And I think that is the biggest change that we as cities need to recognize, which is not only about the physical space, but the kind of education that we provide across all levels of education, K through 12, university, and continuing education. How much entrepreneurship are we putting into our K through 12 programs and schools?
Yep.
How much design-based thinking and 3D printing are we including in our K through 12 schools? I think these are key questions that unfortunately sometimes as mayors or heads of cities, we don't think about because education is something that somebody should do. It's a ministry or some department. But I think it is at the core of what cities are. And we need to revamp this.
Arun.
I mean, I'm fascinated, Fahd, because I can't recall the last time that I agreed so violently with someone who was on the same panel as me. I speak about
agreeing violently. Hashtag agreeing violently, if you don't mind. Yeah, it'd be good.
I mean, we were told before we came on that a fight broke out last year, and that we were encouraged to sort of do this. And so this is my
kind of a reverse fight.
But the this notion of the future of the changing nature of work and the need to include more entrepreneurship and more design thinking education at all levels is also central to sort of the way that we think about cities. Because if you think about one of the implications of sort of technological progress and economic development over the last 150 years has been a fragmentation of different sort of community structures. People who live in cities, are often the loneliest people. There are sort of no natural sort of there used to be the church, there used to be the Rotary Club, there used to be the village community. And in some ways, the organization that you work for, the company that you work for has now become also a basis for sort of community. These are your friends, this is a community structure. And as we start to sort of change the future of work and make it more of an independent, entrepreneurial, sort of come together in a cafe and then dissolve, we have to start thinking about the city as sort of designed to sort of facilitate other forms of community, because otherwise you're going to end up with cities in which people are, there's sort of this disconnectedness. And there's really interesting research that has sort of studied the brain towards establishing that we feel social pain from a lack of connectedness in the same way that we feel physical pain, the same sort of pattern. It's a physiological need. And so making sure that our cities are well designed to sort of nurture alternative forms of community as technologies sort of isolate us from even the sort of organizational community structures that we've built up over the last 50 years is going to be a big challenge in parallel with sort of making sure that our kids are well educated for this new future of work.
Yeah. Joe, you think a lot about global citizenry and portable, obviously, money in your case. And tell us what's driving this impulse. Is it that urbanites want to travel and be around the world, or is it the other way around, that suddenly the advancing in technology is moving people around the world more?
I think it's both, to take the easy answer. I mean, very few people move abroad in search of a worse life, right? So nearly always people are moving abroad because they feel there's something more where they're going. And that basic principle of I can have a better life is, whoever you are, I think that's basically the thing that's driving people to move across borders. But yeah, to your point, it's, even as someone living in the city you were born in, like in London, it is quite a lonely place at times, and then moving to New York, you really feel that. So it's very, it's very legitimate that people now, wherever they are in the world, will fall back to digital means of communication for all their sort of social interactions. And then the Silicon Valley's solution to that is virtual reality, which is just the most disastrous way you could possibly solve the lack of actually, physical community. But I think the thing that's really going on is that people are much more footloose than they used to be because of there's like a changing, almost like a changing definition of ownership. So all these startups want you to no longer own stuff in the way you used to. So Airbnb wants you to not even own a house; they want you to live everywhere, wherever you want to live. And then Uber and whatever happens with driverless cars, they want you to not own a car, they want you to just get an Uber. And it's actually economically more viable in New York to get an Uber rather than own a car. I did the maths.
Yeah.
There are many more examples, I'm sure. Seamless wants you to not own a kitchen, they want you to order food. So over time, if you actually adopt all these mission statements of all these companies, you end up with a life which is potentially you don't own anything except a laptop or an app. And then you can literally live anywhere. So whether or not people will widely adopt that as humankind, let's see. And obviously, it's incredibly divisive socially as well because not everyone can adopt that. And I definitely worry in the back of my head that, I think from a socio-economic perspective, Silicon Valley is a complete disaster, to be honest with you, because you've got these luxurious campuses where people just go, they get an Uber to work, they get free massages, they don't ever see the real world anymore. But they believe they're solving problems for the real world, which is, personally, I'm much, much, much more pro the idea of building tech hubs in places like Brooklyn, which have been massively renovated as a result and East London as well. Someone earlier mentioned that East and West London are like different cities. So the tech scene is a big part of regenerating East London.
Yeah. Well, speaking of East London, in our last panel, Alexander was reminding us that all of the innovation in the world isn't changing the lives of people with lower economic opportunity. And Chris, I think could be a sounding board about the environmental challenges of what we're talking about. All these efficiencies, all this new travel, all these wonderful ways of sharing cars is also polluting. It's also creating problems. Tell us a bit about the environmental perspective on this change in urban lifestyle.
Right. Well, I mean, that's where it all comes down to. Even if you personally don't own any of these things, even if it is this sort of service-based economy, much more fluid in terms of mobility and the rest of it, ultimately something has to power it all. And we are, still enormously growing globally, our energy demand. And obviously, in the face of climate change, the solution is going to, by necessity, have to be a pretty radical shift away from fossil fuel in the course of a generation or so. So that really, in the midst of all of this, which is already a pretty difficult thing for a city to manage from a design point of view, from a political and economic point of view, we also have to completely reinvent our energy industrial base at the same time. Fortunately, and here's what I think is the upside, is that what we're seeing, the kind of radical improvement in the quality of renewable energy, smart grids, electrified transport, is in lockstep now with this massive decentralized communication web. And so the way I like to think of it is, you think about, like I mentioned about cars in cities, and why did we turn our cities over to cars? It was to satisfy what a lot of us thought was a pretty great value proposition, which was sort of the 20th century standard value proposition. You want a house, a single-family home with some land around it, ideally. You want a garage with a car in it to get you around, and then you want a job somewhere, usually, and particularly in the early part of the 20th century, far away from where you actually lived, because the places where work happened were not very nice places to be in. All of that has shifted, and there's an emerging value proposition. If you go to places where the sort of next generation smart grid technology is being paired with electric vehicles, renewable energy, where these things are all working really well together to basically upend that value proposition. And now if you go, Bornholm in Denmark is this island where they've got their next generation smart grid technology in place. And in Bornholm, you could, if you had an electric vehicle, fuel it up using wind power on the cheap overnight. then drive to work, plug your car back in, broker back the part of the energy you've stored that you don't need, which is satisfying a huge need of this next generation grid, which is that it needs storage somewhere. And then you're also using smart grid technology, so all of your day-to-day energy needs have become much more efficient, and you're able to use your apps and the rest of it to manage that much more efficiently. Right now, we're 21st century cities, most of us using almost 19th century grid technology and approach, hub and spoke approaches to energy. So that, I think, is not a completely solved piece of this puzzle, but it's a very exciting and dynamic piece of the puzzle that I think actually will ultimately be as much an opportunity to live much better as this sort of climate problem that we need to solve.
Very good. Well, this morning I started out by saying that anybody in the audience could also be on stage. So now we're going to start shifting the focus to you, hoping you have some questions. And our panelists are ready. They're geared up. There are 3 more books that need to be written between now and the end of the panel. So let's please get to that. And does anyone want to start out with a question? And if I don't see a hand go up quickly, I'm going to pivot back to our team here. I also may call on one of our friends to do that. You see a question? Yes. Do we have a microphone for everyone? If you'd please identify yourselves, if that's possible. So here comes we're asking you to come and be seen. Is that the idea? It's in the back, yeah. She's chasing you, you're chasing her. It's really exciting. It's a mini-series.
Yeah, well, when Mr. Al-Rasheed was speaking about...
Could you identify yourself? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Marie-Claude Ducas. I'm a journalist. I'm, among other things, acting as journalist in residence with Montreal's Living Lab. And when Mr. Al-Rasheed talk about the way of not doing forced engineering, of course, the name of Las Vegas came to my mind. So I'd be curious to hear what you think about what could be the future of a city like Las Vegas, and can it make sense at all in the future?
Well, let me tell you that cities are the most competitive space in the world. There are 247,000 cities around the world competing for 2 things, for capital and for us. They want us to be there. They want us to invest our lives there. So I don't see myself as a builder of a city. I see myself as somebody who is providing an environment in which people can thrive and companies can thrive. I think the question of Las Vegas is an eternal question on if a city needs to be successful, it needs to have a certain niche. It needs to really know what it wants to be when it grows up, if you will. And cities that don't do that, that don't reinvent themselves, over time, they die. Cities are born, but they also die. And I think the question is for us, for example, I'll give you the King Abdullah Economic City answer to this, is that we started as a global manufacturing and logistics hub. So like I said, we put in a port and industrial zone, but we are now moving more and more into education, healthcare, and tourism, believe it or not, in Saudi Arabia. I hope you visit me one day. But the question on tourism, for example, how are you going to do tourism in Saudi Arabia? And the answer to that is we can't compete with Montreal, with London, with Paris, any of these great cities on tourism if we're just going to compete for the same market, if you will. So we focus on what we can focus on, which is religious visitors. We are already the 17th most visited country in the world. We are increasing that number of visitors. Saudis take 10 million trips a year abroad. They have very little options in the country, so we're offering them something. And we are a G20 economy, but we don't have sufficient meeting space for business. So we are offering all of that. And again, I'm not answering, I'm running away from the Las Vegas question, but telling you that Las Vegas and other cities need to just figure out what they do really well and do more of it, and figure out where they can expand into and when the market requires.
Thank you.
Just add something to that. Just on the specific subject of Las Vegas, and obviously we look at it and we think it's kind of a ridiculous thing that we built this fast-growing city in the middle of a desert that has golf courses and giant fountains and the rest of it, and it looks uniquely vulnerable, particularly in the age of climate change. The one thing I would caution is thinking that we have any means of understanding mechanistically how the vulnerabilities of the climate change age are going to play out. And to make that clear, we don't really know. We know that there is going to be enormous amounts of change. We don't really know until it starts to happen. There are flash floods in Houston, and suddenly Houston is the city, and otherwise, good climactically that is now subject, at least for now, to these flash floods. I live in Alberta. We had an entire city of 85,000 evacuate in an afternoon in the face of the most ferocious wildfire that anyone had ever seen. They're a small city, but still, we discovered all at once a vulnerability we didn't know was there. And that's not to say, therefore, Vegas is going to do fine and the rest of us are in trouble. It's more to say every city, I think, is as potentially vulnerable as we might think a city like Las Vegas is. And so as we think about how to build and plan and grow our cities, we also need to be well aware of what the risks are, what the vulnerabilities are, and how to, and then this is an incredibly difficult problem, but how to manage a city in the face of that much uncertainty, which is I think, a fairly new thing in the kind of industrial age anyway, that our cities are all sitting in these places that used to be quite stable or reasonably stable and maybe aren't anymore.
Very good. We have a question up front here. If we can get a microphone to this lady here, right here.
My name is Bridget Shea. I'm a county commissioner in Austin, Texas. And I was really struck by the earlier panel talking about the need to preserve the soul of a city, and also struck by your comments that cities are all competing with each other for capital and for talent. We're struggling in Austin with how we preserve our quality of life and what was one of our unique niches, which is music and our artistic culture and a kind of a funky, laid-back, slacker culture. But so many people want to move to Austin that those artists and musicians and slackers can literally no longer afford to live there. And in fact, so many of the people that help make Austin such a remarkable place to live are being driven out of the city. And so the whole nature and culture of the place is changing. And I don't know how anybody deals with that. I hear that everywhere. Everybody I talk to struggles with the same problem. So I'd love any of your thoughts on that.
So it's #SlackerGap. And how do we take care of these people?
Can I address this?
Please.
Well, I think that this is one of the biggest challenges of success in cities. Cities that have become, for example, great tourist destinations, they create lots of jobs. The value of real estate increases significantly, but these same industries create the lowest income categories, and it means that all of the people that are working and serving these people that are touring have to live outside of the city. And you see this in London, you see this in New York, and many other places. I'll tell you how we are addressing the challenge, because the easiest way to create slums in a new city is to actually not plan for the jobs that you're going to have. So we projected the jobs that we're going to create over the next 20 years. We know exactly by income category what these jobs will be, and we have mandated, self-mandated, that, for example, 20% of our housing will be in the affordable category, 40% in middle income, and just 10% actually at the high end. So this kind of, the idea of a city planning for the future of jobs and actually having housing that is related to it is, I think, one of the most important success pillars for a new city.
I mean, I just to sort of add to that
Please.
real quickly. I mean, it's an interesting problem because I mean, I was smiling as you were describing the image that you were trying to sort of encourage, because you attract all of these slacker types, and then nobody's doing the work to sort of make the city progress, and you sort of wonder what happened. But I mean, there are lots of neighborhoods of Brooklyn that face the same challenge of, like, the artists and the musicians sort of being sort of displaced by progress. And to me, another part of Austin's specific signature is their tech culture, right? And they are sort of becoming a hub for tech. And fundamentally, I think the answer to how do you balance the interests of different groups that you want to shape the identity of the city is to be proactive about thinking about ways in which you're going to sort of systemically reduce inequality. Because affordable housing interventions will work up to a point, but fundamentally, the thinking has to be what are the kinds of policies that I, as a city, can enact that will actually encourage entrepreneurship by the people who are like, most musicians aren't full-time musicians. Most artists aren't full-time artists. There's a wide variety of, I don't want to go back to sort of sharing economy because, I feel like, it's a little self-serving, but, the promise there is sort of widespread decentralized entrepreneurship where someone who has artistic visions can sort of pursue a way of sort of making, and that there's sort of an inequality reduction that happens over time. And so if you think one step further and say, well, what is it about my city, rather than saying, how do I make it affordable for these people by changing prices for them, you could sort of turn the question around and say, how do I make it affordable for them by changing income for them?
Right. So we have time for one more question, and you've been very patient. You already have the microphone, so off we go.
So my name is Iona Strelitz, and I'm from London. And this question was pregnant with the first panel, but it's really provoked by your point on cities competing for people. And I'm so conscious of the cities who are competing at the moment to keep people out, and the countries that are competing on behalf of their cities to keep people out of the whole country. So I'd like just to reset the agendas somewhat by putting on the table some of the dystopian themes that are very much with us about unwanted migration and about security threats, and to wonder what observations this panel might have about the way urban tech might play into those scenarios.
Very good. Who wants to take a run at that? Joe, I may have to put you on the spot.
Professor?
Could you rephrase the question just sort of slightly?
I've got it back again. Low tech.
I'm really good at answering another question. I could answer a different question, but I just want to. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that your media training has left you wanting to answer my question, not what you wanted to say. So there are, we talked today about good things on the table, the exciting young projects, the startup projects that we hear about. And it's very easy when we talk about our scenario just to bag up a collection of good things and not talk about the cross-section of urban issues that we face. I agree differently in some cities than in others. But there are really real issues which, as Hill mentioned today, about migration. Certainly not all cities are competing for people. Lots of cities are really competing to keep people out, to throw that problem of migration over the wall into someone else's turf. And the second point that there's been very little reference to is to urban terrorism, which, I feel acutely pained by in the UK last week, which Chiara didn't reference in relation to Paris, which no one has referenced in relation to Orlando. What future lifestyles are we talking about when people are fearful of these new realities, and can, and how can, if it can, urban tech help?
Okay, well, I can take a stab at this. It's a really good question, and two things that, I guess two underlying causes here of some of the issues that you're highlighting are inclusion and trust, and on the inclusion front, on the are we sort of reaching a point in the evolution of digital technology where the positive impacts of it are going to start to be felt by people across the socioeconomic spectrum? And when we have something resembling a smartphone in the hands of not just sort of 20% of the population, but all of the population, are there ways in which we can sort of leverage this digital footprint to actually start to bring some of the innovations to sort of people outside of the top half of the income spectrum? And I think this sort of connection between the digital world and the physical world is going to start to sort of impact people at the lower end of the income spectrum as well. Chris, you spoke a bit about needing to think about rethink the way that we produce energy. I think that one of the biggest opportunities, the future opportunities of sort of crowd-based capitalism is in sort of inventing local energy supply models that will sort of like, make energy both affordable and more efficient for people who are sort of now not connected to the centralized. And so that's on the inclusion front. But the allusion to Orlando, it's part of it has to do with sort of a negative aspect of digital technology, which is that it puts us in our own filter bubbles. We sort of like, it creates this illusion that somehow we are able to access all of the information that we want. But when in reality, the set of perspectives and the set of like, sort of opinions and like, as you search for things, are getting sort of progressively more sort of focused to like, what you react positively to. And what this ends up doing is polarizing a country and reducing trust across things. And so, I see a lot of promise in the new trust infrastructures that are emerging, that when like, individuals interact with other individuals and have a positive experience, which is what sort of the new economic model is going to look like rather than individuals interacting with institutions, that will sort of start to like, if things go well, that will probably start to sort of reverse some of the mistrust and the suspicion that that is being exacerbated by these filter bubbles that we live in.
Well, I think in the interest of time, this has been an important feature of the conversation. Thank you for introducing it. And I think during the networking break, please feel free to have at it. I think at this point, I'd like to thank our panelists for coming forward and sharing their ideas, and excuse you from the stage with a gratitude. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And thank you, Fahd. Thank you.
Thanks.